In the spring of 1944, Private Donald Burgett of the 101st Airborne Division opened his K-ration breakfast unit somewhere in the English countryside. While preparing for D-Day, inside the waxed cardboard box, he found a can of vile egg and ham chopped together, a packet of 4 cigarettes, some dextrose tablets, a stick of chewing gum, and a small packet of instant coffee that tasted, in his own words, like something drained from a crankcase. He ate it anyway, because he had no choice. That breakfast, which the U.S. Army had scientifically designed to provide exactly 2,830 calories per day when combined with the lunch and dinner units, would be the last hot meal equivalent many paratroopers would see for weeks. The K-ration was not food in any conventional sense. It was compressed survival wrapped in cardboard, and it represented one of the most ambitious and simultaneously disastrous attempts in military history to reduce human nutrition to its absolute minimum requirements, while maintaining combat effectiveness. Burgett survived Normandy, Market Garden, and the Battle of the Bulge, and decades later, he still remembered that breakfast with perfect clarity, which tells you something about how food stays with you when everything else about war becomes a blur. This is not a video about military strategy or battlefield heroics. This is about what you actually put in your mouth when you were a soldier during World War II, how it tasted, what it did to your body, and why every single meal was an act of survival logistics that killed men just as surely as bullets did. Because, while 16 million Americans served in uniform during the war, and roughly 405,000 died in combat, millions more suffered from malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, dysentery, and diseases directly traceable to what they ate or could not eat. The German army marched into Russia with horses because they could not supply their motorized units with fuel, and those horses starved to death by the hundreds of thousands, taking their riders with them. Japanese soldiers in the Pacific quite literally resorted to cannibalism when their supply lines collapsed. British Tommies in North Africa brewed tea so laden with chlorinated water and evaporated milk that veterans described it as tasting like liquid chalk. And American GIs, the best-fed army in the history of warfare, still endured rations so universally despised that the C-ration cheese came to be known as Hitler's secret weapon, because it bound men up so completely that entire platoons went days without a bowel movement. You were about to discover what breakfast, lunch, and dinner actually looked like when your survival depended on supply chains stretching across oceans, when the chef was the quartermaster corps, and when the enemy was trying to kill not just you, but every truck, ship, and railroad car bringing food to the front. We are going to walk through the rations, the field kitchens, the vitamin deficiencies, the contaminated water, the food poisoning outbreaks, and the meals that men remembered 50 years later not because they were good, but because they represented the single most important thing keeping them alive. And by the time we are finished, you will understand why soldiers across every army, every front, and every year of this war shared one universal truth. They were always hungry. The food was always bad, and eating it anyway was the most basic act of defiance they performed every single day. Let's start with what the United States military believed a fighting man actually needed to eat. In 1941, the Army Quartermaster Corps determined that a soldier engaged in moderate activity required approximately 4,000 calories per day, while those in heavy combat could need up to 4,500. The pre-war garrison ration, what soldiers ate at stateside bases, delivered roughly 4,200 calories and weighed about 5 pounds per man per day. It included fresh meat, bread, vegetables, dairy, and fruit. It was expensive, required refrigeration, needed kitchens, and was completely unsuitable for anything resembling actual war. So the Army designed 3 field rations, specifically for combat, the C-ration, the K-ration, and the D-ration, each intended for different tactical situations, and each universally loathed by the men who had to eat them. The C-ration, formerly the United States Army Field Ration Type C, arrived in 6 12-ounce cans providing roughly 3,000 calories per day. 3 cans made up the meat component: meat and beans, meat and spaghetti, each a thick, greasy, oversalted slurry that congealed into a solid mass when cold. The other 3 cans contained biscuits, a powdered beverage, and a dessert unit with hard candy or compressed cereal bars. Every C-ration also included a small accessory packet with cigarettes, matches, chewing gum, toilet paper, and a tiny can opener called a P-38 that soldiers wore on their dog tag chains, because losing it meant eating with a bayonet. The C-ration was designed for short-term use, maybe a week or 2 when kitchens could not operate. In practice, men in Italy ate C-rations for months. Ernie Pyle, the war correspondent who lived with frontline infantry, reported that men grew so sick of the meat and bean combination that they would trade an entire case of it for a single can of fruit cocktail. The cheese that came in some C-rations was so dense, so binding, and so universally hated that medics had to distribute laxatives. Bill Mauldin, the cartoonist whose Willie and Joe characters defined the American infantryman's experience, drew a cartoon of a GI reading the ingredients on a C-ration can and muttering, "I'll be damned, it contains food." That was the joke. The implication being that you could not tell by tasting it. The K-ration, developed by physiologist Ansel Keys in 1941, was supposed to be even more portable, designed for paratroopers, reconnaissance units, and any soldier who needed to carry multiple days of food on his back. Each daily K-ration weighed 32 ounces and came in 3 meal units: breakfast, dinner, and supper. The breakfast unit, the one Donald Burgett opened before D-Day, contained a canned meat product, biscuits, a fruit bar, instant coffee, sugar, and cigarettes. The dinner unit swapped the coffee for lemon powder and added a different canned meat: Opheaton, a tiny tin of processed cheese that had been compressed until it reached the density of a hockey puck. The supper unit contained yet another meat option: bouillon powder and more cigarettes. The whole thing provided approximately 2,830 calories, which was 1,200 calories short of what the Army's own standards said a soldier needed. Keys himself later admitted that the K-ration was never intended for use beyond 5 or 10 days, but soldiers in Europe sometimes ate nothing else for months, because supply officers shipped what was easiest to transport, and the K-ration was very, very easy to transport. Men hated the K-ration even more than the C-ration, because it represented the absolute minimum threshold of edibility. The egg and ham product, served cold because heating it in combat was often impossible, had the texture of wet cat food and tasted like it had been salted by someone with a grudge. The processed cheese, which the Army called cheese product because it did not legally qualify as cheese, could not be spread, could not be melted, and could barely be chewed. Soldiers used it to waterproof their boots. The biscuits were so hard that men broke teeth on them, and the fruit bar, a compressed brick of apricots, prunes, and mysterious binding agents, was so sweet and so dense that eating a whole one induced nausea. Captain Edward Laughlin of the 87th Infantry Division wrote in his diary that after 2 weeks on K-rations, he had lost 15 pounds, and his hands shook constantly. The cigarettes, 4 per meal unit, were among the only components men actively wanted, which tells you everything about the relative value of nicotine versus nutrition in a combat zone. And then there was the D-ration, the emergency ration, a 4-ounce bar of chocolate mixed with oat flour, and just enough sugar to make it barely palatable. The D-ration was not meant to be eaten as a meal. It was meant to keep you alive when you had nothing else, delivering 600 calories in a packet, small enough to fit in a pocket, and durable enough to survive being dropped from an aircraft feet, submerged in water, or leaf eat in the sun for months. The Army commissioned the Hershey Company to develop it in 1941 with one specific instruction: make it taste just barely good enough that soldiers will eat it, but not so good that they eat it when they are not supposed to. Hershey succeeded brilliantly. The D-ration tasted like chocolate-flavored chalk mixed with sadness. It was so hard that you could not bite through it. You had to shave it with a knife or let it dissolve slowly in your mouth. Bill Mauldin described it as tasting like a chocolate-covered peanut bar that somebody stepped on and left it in the sun for a month. Men ate it anyway, because when you have not eaten in 2 days, even chocolate-flavored sadness starts to look like a gift from God. Now, those were the American rations. And the American military was the best-fed force in the entire war by a margin, so vast it borders on obscene. Let me show you what everyone else was eating, and then you will understand just how dire this situation actually became. The British Army entered World War II with a composite ration system designed to deliver 4,000 calories per day, and in theory, it was not terrible. In practice, the British had to feed an empire, supply allies, and cope with German U-boats sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of cargo every month, which meant that what soldiers were supposed to get, and what they actually received, bore almost no resemblance to each other. The British compo ration came in large wooden crates, designed to feed 14 men for 1 day, and it included tinned meat, vegetables, tea, sugar, condensed milk, biscuits, jam, margarine, and packets of dehydrated soup. George MacDonald Fraser, who served in the 14th Army in Burma, described the tea as the single most important component of British military survival. Every halt, every break, every moment of relative safety began with someone brewing tea, and that tea was made by boiling water in old petrol tins that had been emptied, but never cleaned. The result was tea that tasted overwhelmingly of gasoline, but you drank it anyway, because it was hot, it was wet, and it contained enough sugar and condensed milk to constitute a meal by itself. Fraser wrote that you could identify a veteran by how much petrol-flavored tea he could drink, without gagging. The tinned meat was even worse. Bully beef, the same corned beef that had sustained British soldiers in the First World War, came back with a vengeance. It arrived in 12-ounce tins, cold, congealed, and coated in a layer of white fat that had to be scraped off before you could even attempt to eat the meat underneath. In the heat of North Africa, the fat liquefied into an oily slick, and in the cold of Northern Europe, it hardened into something approaching candle wax. Soldiers fried it, boiled it, mixed it into stews, and when they could not stand the sight of it anymore, they buried it. One British officer, stationed in the Western Desert, reported that his unit once dug a 6-foot trench specifically to serve as a bully beef cemetery, because the smell of uneaten tins rotting in the sun had become unbearable. That same officer noted that when fresh rations finally arrived to feed her, 3 months men wept openly at the sight of real bread. The German Wehrmacht marched into World War II with a daily ration of 4,000 calories for frontline troops, built around bread, sausage, cheese, and a hot-cooked meal prepared by field kitchens whenever possible. The standard German field kitchen, the Gulaschkanone or goulash cannon, was a mobile soup cauldron towed behind a truck or pulled by horses, and it could feed an entire company with a single batch of stew. Guy Sayer, a Frenchman who served in the Grossdeutschland division on the Eastern Front, described the arrival of the field kitchen as the most anticipated event of every day. The stew is usually made from potatoes, cabbage, turnips, and whatever meat the supply chain could scrounge. which increasingly meant horse meat as the war dragged on. By 1943, the German ration had been cut to 3,600 calories. By 1944, it dropped to 3,000. And by the winter of 1945, soldiers in some units were receiving fewer than 2,000 calories per day, which is below the threshold required to sustain basic bodily functions, let alone combat. Sarger wrote about the moment he realized the German army was starving when his unit, surrounded near Kursk, spent an entire week eating nothing but a thin soup made from boiled grass and the remains of a dead horse that had been rotting in the sun for 3 days. The soup gave everyone diarrhea, which only accelerated the dehydration and malnutrition. But they ate it anyway, because the alternative was death by starvation. And death by dysentery at least gave you a few more days. Wolfgang Horn, a German soldier captured near Stalingrad, later described trading his watch, his wedding ring, and a photograph of his wife for half a loaf of black bread from a Russian guard. The bread was moldy, rock-hard, and tasted like sawdust, but he cried while eating it, because it was the first solid food he had consumed in 11 days. Hunger, he said, erases everything. It erases dignity, pride, loyalty, and memory. All that remains is the single overpowering need to put something, anything, into your mouth. And then there was the Imperial Japanese Army, which entered the war with a daily ration that was already inadequate by Western standards, and then watched that ration collapse into nothingness as Allied submarines obliterated Japanese supply lines. The standard Japanese ration called for 600 grams of rice, 200 grams of meat or fish, vegetables, miso, and soy sauce, delivering roughly 3,000 calories per day. That was the theory. The reality, especially in the Pacific Island campaigns, was that Japanese soldiers received almost nothing. In New Guinea, the Japanese 18th Army, cut off from resupply, began eating grass, tree bark, roots, and whatever animals they could catch. When those ran out, they ate their horses, then their pack mules, then the leather from their boots, and when that ran out, they ate each other. The official Japanese military record does not discuss cannibalism in explicit terms, but Australian and American forces liberating Japanese positions found human remains that had been butchered, cooked, and consumed. Interviews with Japanese veterans conducted decades after the war confirmed what everyone already knew. Starving men will do anything to survive, and the Japanese supply chain had failed so completely that entire divisions simply ceased to exist, not because they were destroyed in battle, but because they starved to death waiting for food that never came. Tsuji Masanobu, a Japanese staff officer, wrote after the war that more than 60% of Japanese military deaths in the Pacific Theater resulted not from combat, but from starvation and disease. That is not an estimate. That is a documented fact derived from post-war casualty analysis. The Japanese army did not lose the Pacific campaign because it was outfought. It lost because it could not feed itself. Now, let us talk about what happens to your body when you eat nothing. But military rations for months or years at a time, because the human body was not designed to run on canned meat, hardtack biscuits, and cigarettes. And it will let you know that in ways both immediate and catastrophic. Vitamin deficiencies came first. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, had supposedly been solved by the British Navy in the 18th century with citrus rations, but it came roaring back during World War II in places where fresh fruit and vegetables could not be delivered. British soldiers in the siege of Tobruk, isolated in the North African desert for 241 days, began showing symptoms after 6 weeks: bleeding gums, loosening teeth, joint pain, and a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure. The British compo ration included ascorbic acid tablets, but soldiers frequently discarded them because they tasted terrible and seemed useless compared to food. By the time the siege lighted in November 1941, more than 30% of the garrison showed signs of scurvy, and at least 12 men had lost teeth. Beriberi, caused by a lack of thiamine, plagued soldiers eating polished white rice, particularly in the Pacific Theater. The Japanese army lost thousands of men to it in Burma and New Guinea. Symptoms included severe muscle weakness, nerve damage, heart failure, and in extreme cases, death. Allied prisoners of war held by the Japanese died of beriberi in staggering numbers, because their captors fed them nothing but rice and watery soup. At Changi prison in Singapore, doctors estimated that more than 70% of POWs showed symptoms of thiamine deficiency by mid-1943. Pellagra, caused by a lack of niacin, appeared among soldiers subsisting on corn-based rations without adequate meat or vegetables. It produced a characteristic triad of symptoms that medical officers called the 4 Ds: dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and death. Italian soldiers in East Africa, cut off from resupply and eating local maize without the traditional lime treatment that unlocks niacin, developed pellagra in epidemic proportions. British medical officers treating captured Italian troops in 1941 reported that more than 1,500 prisoners showed advanced symptoms, including severe mental confusion, open sores covering their arms and legs, and chronic bloody diarrhea that left them too weak to walk. And we have not even talked about the water yet, which might be the most dangerous thing you put in your body during this entire war. Clean drinking water was the single most important logistical challenge of World War II, a fetor ammunition, and it was the one thing armies consistently failed to provide. The U.S. Army required 1 gallon of water per man per day for drinking and cooking, and an additional 4 gallons for bathing, laundry, and sanitation. In the deserts of North Africa, that requirement jumped to 2 gallons for drinking alone, because men sweated through their uniforms within hours. The British 8th Army in Egypt relied on water delivered by tanker trucks from the Nile, and every gallon was chlorinated so heavily that it tasted like swimming pool runoff. Soldiers called it death water and drank it anyway, because dehydration killed faster than dysentery. Except dysentery killed quite efficiently on its own. Dysentery, both amoebic and bacillary, ripped through armies on every front. It spread through contaminated water, unwashed hands, and the flies that swarmed over latrines and then landed on food. Symptoms included severe abdominal cramping, bloody diarrhea, dehydration, and fever. In tropical climates, it killed within days if untreated. The U.S. Army's official medical history records that in the Mediterranean theater alone, more than 450,000 American soldiers were hospitalized for diarrheal diseases between 1943 and 1945. That is more casualties than all the combat wounds from the Italian campaign combined. The 1st Marine Division at Guadalcanal reported that by October 1942, more than 75% of its men were suffering from some form of gastric illness, most of it traceable to contaminated water and food. Men lost 20, 30, even 40 pounds in a matter of weeks, their bodies consuming themselves because they could not absorb nutrients from the limited food they were eating. Typhoid fever, spread through fecal-oral contamination, hit armies that failed to enforce sanitation discipline. The German army in Russia suffered tens of thousands of typhoid cases during the winter of 941, when frozen ground made latrine digging impossible, and soldiers defecated wherever they could find shelter. When the spring thaw came, runoff from those improvised latrines flowed directly into streams and rivers that troops used for drinking water. The predictable epidemic followed, incapacitating entire battalions. Hepatitis A also spread through contaminated food and water sent another 200,000 American soldiers to hospitals during the war. The disease caused jaundice, extreme fatigue, liver inflammation, and complete loss of appetite at precisely the moment when soldiers needed every calorie they could get. Recovery took weeks or months, and men who returned to duty often remained weak for the rest of the war. Cholera, the great killer of the 19th century, reappeared in the China-Burma-India theater, where Allied forces operated in regions with no sanitation infrastructure whatsoever. The disease caused such rapid dehydration through continuous diarrhea and vomiting that men could die within 12 hours of symptom onset. British and American medical officers distributed water purification tablets and strict orders to boil all drinking water, and soldiers ignored those orders constantly. Because boiling water required fuel, time, and a willingness to wait when you were desperately thirsty. The result was predictable. The China-Burma-India theater had the highest disease casualty rate of any operational area in the entire war, with more than 80% of all evacuations attributed to illness rather than combat wounds. And here is the detail that should genuinely disturb you. The United States military, with the most advanced logistics system ever created, with dedicated quartermaster units, refrigerated ships, supply depots the size of small cities, and the industrial capacity to produce literally anything it needed, still could not consistently feed its soldiers properly. What that tells you about every other army in this war is almost too grim to articulate. Let me give you a specific example of what combat rations actually looked like on the ground. Not in a supply manual, but in the hands of a soldier who had to eat them under fire. It is June 1944, and you have just landed at Normandy as part of the second wave. You are soaking wet, you have not slept in 36 hours, and you are crouched behind a hedgerow while German machine gun fire tears through the branches above your head. Your last hot meal was 2 days ago on the transport ship, a breakfast of powdered eggs, spam, coffee, and toast that you threw up over the side an hour later when the channel crossing got rough. Since then, you have eaten 2 K-rations and half a D-ration bar. Your stomach is cramping, your mouth tastes like metal and cigarette ash, and you are so hungry that the K-ration ham and eggs, which you gagged on yesterday, now sounds almost appealing. You pull the waxed cardboard box out of your pack, tear it open, and find the breakfast unit. 1 small can labeled, chopped ham and eggs. 1 packet of 4 biscuits, rock hard and flavorless. A small envelope of instant coffee powder. 3 sugar tablets, a stick of chewing gum, 4 Chesterfield cigarettes, and a tiny box of matches that are already damp from the landing. You open the can with your P38, and the contents smell like salted cat food mixed with something vaguely chemical. It is cold, obviously, because heating it would require a fire, and fires draw artillery. You eat it with your fingers, scooping the greasy chunks directly into your mouth, while trying not to think about the texture. It tastes like salt, lard, and regret. You chase it with the biscuits, which are so dry they stick to the roof of your mouth, and then you mix the coffee powder into your canteen water, which tastes like chlorine and metal, and drink it down. The whole meal takes maybe 3 minutes. You light one of the cigarettes, and your hands stop shaking for about 10 minutes. Then the hunger comes back. That was breakfast. Lunch will be another K-ration, probably the dinner unit with the cheese brick and the lemon powder that makes canteen water taste like furniture polish. Supper will be the same, and tomorrow will be the same. And the day after that. You will eat K-rations until your unit moves far enough from the beach for the field kitchens to catch up, which might be a week from now, or might be a month. And when the field kitchens do arrive, you will get hot food for the first time in weeks, and you will cry a little bit because you had forgotten what hot food felt like. That is not exaggeration. That is documented in dozens of letters, diaries, and oral histories. Men cried over hot coffee and warm stew not, because they were weak, but because the deprivation had been so total and so prolonged that the restoration of something normal broke through every defense they had built. Now let's talk about what happened when supply lines failed completely, because that is where this story gets truly horrifying. When the 101st Airborne Division dropped into Bastogne in December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, they brought enough K-rations to last maybe 3 days. The German offensive cut them off entirely. No resupply trucks could get through, and the weather was too bad for airdrops. By December 23rd, the division was on quarter rations, meaning 1 K-ration per day split among 4 men. By Christmas, they were eating 1 meal every other day. Medics reported widespread symptoms of starvation, dizziness, weakness, inability to concentrate, and a psychological phenomenon where men stopped talking about anything except food. Private Webster described sitting in a frozen foxhole, composing elaborate fantasy menus in his head, dishes he would cook when he got home, recipes he had never cared about before the war, but now occupied every waking thought. His squad mates were doing the same thing. Entire conversations consisted of men describing steaks, roasts, pies, fresh bread, butter, eggs, bacon, anything except the handful of crackers and the sliver of cheese that constituted their daily ration. When the weather cleared on December 26th and supply planes finally dropped rations, men abandoned cover and ran into open fields under German fire to retrieve the bundles. Several were killed. They knew the risk, and they ran anyway because the hunger had become unbearable. The official casualty reports list them as killed in action, which is technically true. But what really killed them was starvation logistics. British forces trapped at Arnhem during Operation Market Garden in September 1944 faced the same nightmare. The 1st Airborne Division dropped with 3 days of rations and found themselves cut off for 9 days. They ate their emergency rations on day 4. By day 6, they were scavenging food from dead soldiers, both British and German, because a corpse might have half a chocolate bar or a few biscuits in his pack. By day 8, men were eating raw tulip boophounds dug from Dutch gardens, which caused vomiting and diarrhea, but at least put something in their stomachs. When the survivors finally withdrew across the Rhine, more than 1,400 of the original 10,000 were dead or captured, and every man who made it out had lost significant weight. Medical officers examining the survivors found that the average weight loss was 15 to 20 pounds over 9 days, which is catastrophic. Japanese soldiers in the Pacific endured conditions that make Bastogne and Arnhem look like catered events. The 18th Army in New Guinea, completely cut off by Allied naval forces, simply stopped receiving supplies in mid-1943. The official ration dropped to 200 grams of rice per day. Then 100 grams. Then nothing. Soldiers boiled grass, palm fronds, tree bark, and roots into a watery soup that provided almost no nutrition. They caught rats, lizards, insects, anything that moved. They ate snails, frogs, and grubs, and when all of that ran out, they died. Or they turned to cannibalism. Post-war interviews with Japanese survivors confirmed that some units began killing and consuming the dead. Australian troops advancing through the jungle found Japanese encampments with cooking fires, surrounded by butchered human remains. The Japanese government has never officially acknowledged this, but the evidence is overwhelming, and it is documented in Allied intelligence reports, medical examinations of liberated POWs who had witnessed it, and in the private diaries of Japanese officers who recorded the collapse of discipline. One officer wrote that he ordered his men not to eat the dead, knowing they would ignore him, because the alternative was watching them starve, and at least cannibalism kept some of them alive long enough to attempt a breakout. None of them made it. The 18th Army entered New Guinea with roughly 55,000 men. Fewer than 13,000 survived the war, and the majority of deaths were attributed to starvation and disease. Let me frame all of this with the numbers, because the scale of food-related casualties in World War II is almost incomprehensible. The U.S. Army Medical Department calculated that disease and non-battle injuries, the vast majority of which stemmed directly from contaminated food and water, accounted for more than 1.7 million hospitalizations in the European theater alone. The Mediterranean theater added another 1.2 million. The Pacific added 1.4 million more. That is 4.3 million American soldiers hospitalized for illnesses, most of them preventable with clean water and adequate nutrition. Total American combat deaths in World War II, 405,000. Total disease hospitalizations, 4.3 million. The food was killing more men than the enemy, just more slowly. The British Army suffered similar rates. In Burma, the 14th Army reported that for every man evacuated due to combat wounds, 120 were evacuated due to disease, primarily dysentery, malaria exacerbated by malnutrition, and vitamin deficiencies. The official British medical history estimates that more than 60% of all casualties in the Burma campaign were disease-related. The German military lost approximately 5.3 million men total during the war, and post-war analysis suggests that at least 1.5 million of those deaths resulted from starvation, disease, and exposure on the Eastern Front, where supply failures were systematic and catastrophic. The Japanese military lost between 2.1 and 2.5 million men, and as I mentioned earlier, more than 60% of those deaths came from starvation and disease rather than combat. That means roughly 1.4 million Japanese soldiers died because they could not eat. Add it all together, and you are looking at millions of deaths directly attributable to food supply failures. Not because armies did not understand nutrition. They did. Not because the food technology did not exist. It did. But because keeping millions of men fed across multiple continents, while people are actively trying to sink your supply ships, bomb your railroads, and destroy your field kitchens turned out to be a problem that no military on Earth could fully solve. And here is the thing that makes all of this even more tragic. Soldiers knew the food was killing them. They wrote about it constantly. Letters home, diaries, memoirs published decades later, all of them talk about the hunger, the sickness, the obsessive food fantasies, the weight loss, the weakness, the constant low-grade nausea from eating rancid rations. They knew, and they ate it anyway, because the alternative was immediate death rather than slow decline, and humans will always choose slow decline if it buys them another day. Bill Malden wrote that the infantryman's definition of luxury was a hot meal, dry socks, and 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep, in that order. Not safety, not victory, not even survival. Just a hot meal. That is what it came down to. That is what every soldier, on every front, in every army, wanted more than almost anything else. Just one meal that did not taste like punishment. Ernie Pyle, the war correspondent who was killed by Japanese machine gun fire on Ie Shima in 1945, spent years embedded with American infantry units, and he wrote that the most common topic of conversation among frontline soldiers was not women, not home, not even the war itself, but food. Men would spend hours describing meals they had eaten before the war, recipes their mothers made, restaurants they planned to visit, elaborate multi-course dinners that existed only in their imaginations. Pyle wrote that this was not idle fantasy. It was psychological survival. Talking about food kept them connected to a world where eating was not an act of endurance, where meals were something you enjoyed rather than something you choked down to stay alive. He also wrote that he once watched a supply truck arrive at a forward position carrying fresh bread, the first anyone had seen in 2 months, and grown men fought each other for the loaves. Not playfully, not as a joke. They actually fought, swinging fists and grappling in the dirt. Because fresh bread represented something so far beyond normal experience that it triggered a kind of temporary madness. Officers had to restore order by pulling men apart and rationing the bread 1 slice per person. Pyle wrote that he had seen men survive artillery barrages without flinching, but the arrival of fresh bread reduced them to crying, fighting children. That is what hunger does. It does not make you noble. It does not build character. It strips away every layer of civilization and leaves you with the single overpowering drive to eat. And when that drive goes unsatisfied for long enough, you stop being the person you were and become something else, something old, something that will do absolutely anything for 1 more meal. So here is your final accounting. You are a soldier in World War II, and every single day you are eating food that tastes like industrial waste, drinking water that might give you dysentery, and watching your body consume itself, because the 3,000 calories in your ration are barely enough to keep you functional, and nowhere near enough to sustain combat operations. You are losing weight. Your gums are bleeding. Your joints ache. You are constipated from the cheese, and simultaneously suffering from diarrhea caused by contaminated water, which is a special kind of physiological hell. You have not eaten a fresh vegetable in 3 months. You have not tasted real meat in even longer. The biscuits have broken 2 of your teeth. The coffee tastes like poison. The cigarettes are the only good part of the ration, and you smoke all of them, even though you never smoked before the war, because they are the one thing that makes the hunger stop for 10 minutes. And tomorrow, you will do it again. And the day after that, you will eat the canned ham that smells like death. You will drink the chlorinated water that tastes like a swimming pool. You will chew the biscuits that could double as building materials. And you will do it not because you are brave or strong or disciplined, but because eating is the most basic form of defiance available to you. Every meal is an assertion that you are still here, still alive, still capable of putting something in your mouth, and swallowing it even when every fiber of your being is screaming that this is not food, this is punishment, disguised as nutrition. The horrifying food of a World War II soldier was not an accident. It was not incompetence. It was the inevitable result of trying to feed millions of men operating thousands of miles from home, while someone was actively trying to kill them and destroy every supply line feeding them. The rations were scientifically designed. The logistics were the most sophisticated in human history. The industrial capacity behind them was staggering, and it still was not enough. It was never going to be enough, because war does not care about nutrition science or supply chain optimization. War cares about bullets and bombs and whether the men pulling the triggers are still breathing. And if keeping them breathing means feeding them something that barely qualifies as food, then that is what you do. And if some of them die from dysentery or scurvy or starvation, well, that is just wastage. That is just the cost of doing business. Private Donald Burgett survived the war. He came home, and decades later he wrote about Normandy, about Market Garden, about Bastogne, about all of it. And in every book, in every interview, he talked about the food. Not the battles, not the heroism. The food, the K-rations he ate in a waterlogged foxhole while artillery screamed overhead. The biscuits that tasted like cardboard, the egg and ham that made him gag. He remembered it all with perfect clarity, because that breakfast, that terrible, unforgettable breakfast, was the last moment of ordinary human routine before everything turned into chaos and blood and death. The food could not save you, but it could keep you alive long enough to save yourself. And for 16 million American soldiers, and hundreds of millions more across every army in this war, that had to be enough.